Imagine for a moment the ultimate no-win scenario. Your tank is crippled, your platoon is surrounded, and the enemy is just 200 yards away, their machine guns trained on your position. You prepare to fight to the last round, but then the firing stops, not because of a surrender, but because the very ground beneath both armies begins to disappear. This is the story of a forgotten battle on the Italian front, where a sudden wall of water-trapped German panzers and British Shermans, together on a shrinking island of mud, and the impossible truce that was their only hope of survival. Understand how both armies ended up fighting for their lives against the same enemy. We must travel to the autumn of 1943. Following the Allied invasion of Italy, the German Wehrmacht had established a series of formidable defensive lines across the country. The Volturno Line was the southernmost of these, anchored by the Biferno River, which flowed west to east into the Adriatic Sea, just south of the small but strategically vital port of Termoli. By early October, the British 43rd Division had pushed east, and on the night of the 2nd, Operation Devon was launched. Commandos and special forces secured the port of Termoli itself, allowing Allied infantry to ford the Biferno and secure a shallow bridgehead while Royal engineers scrambled to repair the demolished bridges. The key to holding this fragile foothold was armor. If German panzers could reach the bridgehead before the Allies could get their tanks across the river, the infantry would be annihilated. The unit tasked with this desperate race was C Squadron, 3rd County of London. Yeomanry, the sharpshooters. Their mission, get their Sherman tanks across the Biferno and fast. But the Germans were just as quick to react. The elite 16th Panzer Division was already rolling towards Termoli, their Mark IV and Panther tanks poised to crush the Allied beachhead. Little did either side know that a far more powerful force was about to enter the battlefield, one that respected no chain of command. On the afternoon of October 4th, the situation became critical. Major Bobby Gale of C Squadron knew the bridges were out. The main road bridge was a skeleton of twisted steel, and German engineers had done their work well. The only option was a ford, a shallow crossing point in the river where the water was low, enough to attempt a crossing. But the Biferno was deceptive. The autumn rains had begun, and the river, though calm, was rising. By 1400 hours, the first Sherman tanks of C Squadron plunged into the muddy waters. One by one, they churned across, the water lapping at their hulls. It was a success. But as the heavy 30-ton tanks churned the soft riverbed, they carved deep ruts into the clay. The ford quickly became a death trap. One Sherman, caught in the mire, foundered in midstream, its engine flooding as the brown water poured into its lower hull. The crossing had to be abandoned. A handful of tanks, perhaps 6 or 7 Shermans, had made it across. The rest of the squadron and the vital reinforcements were trapped on the far bank. Now came the crisis. Those 6 Shermans, commanded by Major Gale, rolled into Termoli and took up defensive positions on the high ground overlooking the main road. They were alone. Behind them, the impassable Biferno. Ahead of them, the vanguard of the 16th Panzer Division. For 2 days, the tiny British force held the line, their 75mm guns dueling with the superior armor of the German panzers. But on the night of October 5th, a new threat emerged, one that had nothing to do with tank warfare. The rains upstream had been relentless. The Biferno, already swollen, began to burst its banks. Water surged across the plains, turning roads into canals and low ground into lakes. The Germans, sensing victory, pressed their attack, only to find their Panzer I-4s grinding to a halt as the floodwaters rose. Pause. Both forces were now trapped, not by each other, but by the fury of nature. The river had become a trap, and there was no high ground left. By dawn on October 6th, the strategic situation had ceased to exist. The battlefield was gone. In its place was a vast, churning inland sea. The few British tanks in Termoli were running low on fuel and ammunition. The German panzers, caught in the open lowlands, were being swallowed by the mud. Their tracks spun uselessly as the water rose to their engine decks. Men from both sides were forced to abandon their vehicles, scrambling onto the engine, decks, or climbing onto any piece of high ground they could find: a flooded farmhouse, a raised embankment, the top of a half-submerged barn. Imagine the scene. British tankers and German panzer grenadiers, separated by just a few hundred yards of freezing water, watching their tanks slowly sink into the abyss. There was no front line. There was only survival. The wounded from both sides cried out in the same language of pain. It was a complete stalemate. Neither side could advance, neither could retreat, and the water was still rising. This was the crisis point. Men were beginning to drown. What happened next would defy every military regulation ever written. It began with a single act of humanity. A German medical officer, standing waist-deep in the freezing water near a stranded half-track, raised a white flag, not of surrender, but of desperation. He had wounded men who would not survive another hour in the cold. He needed to get them to higher ground, to the very same elevated farmhouse where a group of British soldiers were huddled. Across the flooded plain, the British saw the flag. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a British sergeant, acting without orders, waved back. He signaled for the Germans to come forward. It was a risk. It could have been a trick. But as the German medics began wading through the flood, carrying their wounded on stretchers held above their heads, the British soldiers lowered their rifles. They helped them up onto the dry ground. This was not a surrender. It was a truce. An unspoken, unauthorized ceasefire born of absolute necessity. For the next several hours, as the floodwaters peaked, a fragile peace settled over the submerged battlefield. British soldiers shared their emergency rations with freezing German tank crews. German medics treated wounded British gunners. They were no longer enemies. They were just men, united against a common indifferent foe. On that tiny patch of dry land, an informal truce was observed. Both sides knew the water would eventually recede. Both sides knew the fight would resume. But for now, survival took precedence over victory. Late afternoon on October 6th, the rains finally stopped. The floodwaters began to slowly recede, revealing a landscape of churned mud, destroyed farms, and the hulks of drowned tanks. As the water level dropped, the truce ended. The British soldiers and German Panzer Grenadiers who had shared that high ground returned to their own lines. The battle resumed. But the delay caused by the flood was decisive. The respite it provided allowed the Royal Engineers to finally complete a Bailey Bridge across the Bifernal. With the bridge secure, the rest of the sharpshooters' tanks and reinforcements poured across, linking up with Major Gale's stranded squadron. The 16th Panzer Division, battered by the flood and facing fresh Allied armor, was forced to retreat. Termoli was saved. The exact number of men saved by that impromptu truce is unknown, but the humanity shown in those flooded fields stands as a testament to the strange contradictions of war. No medals were awarded for this act. No official records were kept. It was simply a moment when the instinct to survive overcame the instinct to destroy.